With breaking news, U.S. Customs and Border Protection now ordering medical checks on every child in its custody after an 8-year-old boy from Guatemala died on Christmas Eve. This is the second death of an immigrant child while in the agency's care in just the last month.
Now, this tragedy highlights the standoff between Congress and the President Trump over his demand for billions of dollars to construct a wall along the border with Mexico. The president doubling down, vowing the government shutdown will go on until his wall is funded. We're now in day 5 of this shutdown with no sign of any agreement. And all this comes as CNN has learned that the president's Treasury Secretary may be in, quote, serious jeopardy after failing to calm the markets. We've got it all covered. Let's begin with CNN's Nick Valencia live in El Paso, Texas. Nick?
Good morning, John. Here we are less than 3 weeks since a 7-year-old Guatemalan girl died in Customs and Border Protection custody. Now, this time it happened to an 8-year-old boy. That 8-year-old migrating from Central America, from Guatemala as well, with his father, and had been in Customs and Border Protection custody since December 18th. Along with his father, he was shuffled through a variety of processing centers, including one that was overcrowded. And according to a release sent out yesterday by CBP, it was one of their agents that initially noticed that this boy was having health problems. He was taken to the hospital, diagnosed with a common cold, but then he was kept an hour longer for observation because he had a fever. Even though he had that fever, he was allowed to be released. And it was just a few hours later, that night, in fact, on Christmas Eve, that his condition deteriorated, even though he was being given medication. He started being nauseous, was vomiting, and eventually lost consciousness and died at the hospital 14 hours since his symptoms were first noticed. Now, this is the second time a child has died in less than a month, as I mentioned at the start of this report, and has led to some action by the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection. He released some of those action items yesterday in a statement. They include focusing on conducting secondary medical checks for all children, with a focus particularly on children under the age of 10. They're also considering federal help with medical care, bringing in the Coast Guard, more help from the Department of Defense, perhaps even the perhaps even the CDC. And one of the other action items, they're working with ICE on transportation. Oftentimes, these migrants, when they're apprehended in the field, have to wait hours before they're put through the system or transferred to a processing center. I mentioned that this was the second death in less than a month. It was just yesterday that 7-year-old Jacqueline Gal, who died in Customs and Border Protection custody, was laid to rest in her native country of Guatemala. Just an absolutely tragic scene there yesterday, with the government of Guatemala now demanding answers to their questions here as what happened this time with an 8-year-old. They demanded the medical records for this 8-year-old boy, and as we understand it, have also interviewed the father to hear his version of facts. All of this, John and Erica, happening against the backdrop of what CBP calls a dramatic increase of unaccompanied minors and family units. Meanwhile, they're also dealing with a furlough, which is stretching them thin. Erica?
Nick Valencia in El Paso this morning. Nick, thank you. Joining us now to discuss, Matt Gorman, former communications director for the National Republican Congressional Committee, Tulu Olorunnipa, White House reporter for Bloomberg News, and Karin Demirjian, the Washington Post congressional reporter. Good to have all of you with us. Tulu, I want to start with you, because when we look at what is happening there along the border, what Nick has laid out for us, which, of course, we can't deny the connection with the shutdown there that Nick just referred to at the end. Any word at all from the White House on the death of this 8-year-old boy on Christmas Eve? The president has been rather vocal in the last few hours, certainly on Christmas Day, but I haven't heard any mention of this.
Yeah, the president had a prime opportunity to weigh in and talk about this tragic death of a child in U.S. custody yesterday when he was speaking with reporters in the Oval Office and trying to give a Christmas message. But instead, he talked about the wall. He talked about the disgrace that's happening in our country due to James Comey and the investigations that he calls presidential harassment. The White House has said nothing about the death of this young boy or the death of Jacqueline Gal just a couple of weeks ago. And the fact that Department of Homeland Security Secretary Christian Nielsen went before Congress just a few days ago and could not tell members of Congress how many children had died in U.S. custody. This is becoming a major significant problem for this administration after the separation of children from their parents earlier this year. And now there seems to be this sense of disarray within U.S. Customs and Border Protection that they aren't protecting the children that are coming across the border, and that they're getting caught up in the politics. And the president's much more willing to talk about the wall and the government shutdown, and not so much about the tragic death of a child who came here and died in U.S. custody.
Yeah, and when he was focusing yesterday on the wall, Kern, he mentioned that he'd signed off on a segment of the wall, a contract for the wall. This raised a number of questions because the president didn't seem to go through any of the processes nor have any details on said deal. What's the reaction among members of Congress, or what are you hearing about that alleged deal?
I mean, look, Congress has been divided about this wall within the GOP across party lines for a very long time. And I think the president is trying to push ahead as much as he possibly can, whether or not he has all the members of Congress that he needs to have behind him to fund such a thing actually in line. At this point, you've got a stalemate on Capitol Hill because of all that tension over the wall, because of there is no incentive for anybody to make a deal until the powers that be in 2019 actually enter the positions they're going to be in. Democrats are going to take over the House. Republicans in the Senate are frustrated with the president, but they seem to be, not willing to publicly, well, the leaders and who are returning next year seem to be not willing to publicly break with him over this. So the president basically has this open space in which to try to set the message. And for him, the winning message is the wall. It's not acknowledging the deaths of children, because that would be detracting from his message and start to raise more questions about what's really going on at the border. So there are members that are very frustrated by that, but by and large, they are not, the ones who are speaking out are not in his party, or if they are in his party, they're not coming back next year. And so he doesn't really have to worry about them in terms of what sort of political wrangling he's really going to be facing when we get to the point at which this shutdown deal is addressed in a more long-term way.
The president really had a captive audience, of course, yesterday when he was making those calls and went off on a number of tangents. It was sort of... it was more Festivus-esque than Christmas, which he had missed Festivus by a couple of days.
Feats of strength.
But even... let's listen to a little bit more of what he had to say, because in that as well, I just want to point out some facts that we're missing. So let's take a listen first.
I can't tell you when the government's going to be open. I can tell you it's not going to be open until we have a wall, a fence, whatever they'd like to call it. I'll call it whatever they want. Every one of those Democrats approved the wall, or a fence, or very, very substantial barriers. As soon as I said I want to build the wall, they were all against it. Take Comey. Everybody hated Comey. They thought he did a horrible job. The Democrats hated him. And once I fired him, everybody said, oh, why did you fire him? Why did you fire him? It's a disgrace what's happening in our country. But other than that, I wish everybody a very Merry Christmas. Yesterday, I gave out 115 miles worth of wall. 115 miles in Texas. That's a big stretch, because we're talking about 500 to 550 miles total. It's my hope to have this done, completed, all 500 to 550 miles, to have it either renovated or brand new by election time.
So there was a lot that just happened in all of that sound that we played. But the point that the president made at the end, saying that he gave out 115 miles, just to be clear, the president can't grant contracts. Congress did approve some funding back in March. In November, some contracts were ordered for parts of that, but only about 33 miles of wall. And again, no answers from the White House on where this area is that the president is talking about. So all those questions remain, and there are those facts that can sometimes be pesky and get in the way. Matt, as you look at all of this, this in many ways, though, is classic President Trump. Again, he has this captive audience. He can say whatever he wants in those moments, and whatever he feels, Matt, will make him look good.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is just how isolating the presidency really is. Bill Clinton once called it the crown jewel of the federal penal system, meaning the White House. So I think what we're seeing is President Trump isolated from the rest of his family and friends down in Mar-a-Lago, here at the White House, stewing over these perceived slights and making these public statements. But I think also it's a start of, quite frankly, his reelect. He needs an enemy, and as the other folks talked about too, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are taking that role that we saw Hillary Clinton fill in 2016. President Trump is at his best when he has an antagonist. And I think those folks will play the role until a Democratic frontrunner emerges in Iowa and New Hampshire. But make no mistake, neither party has any incentive to back down from this. The shutdown, I mean, I think they're in every incentive to stand their ground, play to their bases, and I think that's why there's no end in sight.
So, Tolu, given that what Matt just described is essentially a Christmas kabuki around the shutdown with 800,000 people currently not receiving paychecks, what is the end game you are hearing from White House aides? Or is it simply trust the president's gut and we'll deal with this when we have to?
Yeah, it really is the president leading the train on this. Several White House aides do not know where the president's going to be from one moment to another. You have to remember that just a few days ago, the president seemed to have signed off on the Senate deal that would have kept the government open. Mike Pence went over to the Senate and let the senators know that they can vote on a deal to keep the government open, a continuing resolution through February 8th. And then the next morning, the president changed his mind. So a lot of White House aides are just waiting for the president to decide how much he wants to dig in his heels. That we're getting closer and closer to Nancy Pelosi taking the gavel, which will give the Democrats a lot more leverage in this battle over whether to keep the government open. If she holds out until January 3rd, when Democrats take over, they could just pass a very clean funding bill to keep the government open and then force the Senate and the president to decide whether or not they want to continue to fight and keep the government shuttered, even though there are hundreds of thousands of employees, many of them who should be going back from their Christmas holiday today, who are either going to be on furlough or working without pay. And I think as time continues to move forward, more people are going to feel the impact of this government shutdown, which so far hasn't had as much of an impact because of the holiday, because people were already off during the weekend. This is going to become much more of an issue if this drags on for days and days and days.
Karin, there's also the fact that this could have been avoided, right? The president actually could have had a lot more money when it came to border security and the wall less than a year ago when this was up for debate. But that didn't happen. So as we move further and further along, I mean, how much more is there left to give at this point?
Right. I mean, but back before, he could have had $25 billion in exchange for making the deal on the DACA, and he chose not to. At this point, I mean, the trade-off is unclear, right? We're talking about a few $1 billion in a over $4 trillion economy. It's not a huge part of the country that they are stuck on right now, and yet they can't figure out actually how to trade around this one. There has to be something that Democrats are going to see that they can get for actually giving Trump more money towards his wall, because otherwise he's just going to try to drip, get all the money that he needs to actually build this project and never have a full trade-off the way that they started, hoping that there could be some sort of around the immigration issue, each side gets something that they've wanted for a long time. But right now the two sides don't trust each other, and it doesn't really seem clear where they're going to find and gain that trust. If they're able to make some sort of a just meet in the middle money deal, okay, that's one thing, but again, there's no real incentive for them to do that until Democrats can say, we decided to make this deal because we are in power now. But at this point, where they're going to find that special thing that they can trade for probably about $3 billion, not clear.
It's also interesting that just a couple of days ago, we were talking about this on Monday, Mick Mulvaney had said, actually, the president is open to talking about other immigration solutions.
Yeah.
Not sure that's still the case.
It's very unclear what's operative. And so in the spirit of solutions, something vanishingly rare in Washington, Matt, I ask you, if you were advising the president and Republicans, what would you say is a way out of this that could get the government open again?
I would say the only way out of this is to negotiate directly with Chuck Schumer. That's the only way this will end. You need Democratic votes in the Senate. Your leverage is rapidly decreasing, as many folks have said. Once January 3rd hits, Nancy Pelosi becomes Speaker at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. You have a new Democratic House majority, and your leverage goes away very quickly. And if you couldn't get wall funding done with 2 years of complete GOP control of Congress, you're certainly not going to get it under a Speaker Pelosi. The longer you wait, the less leverage you have. And so you need to take it directly to Chuck Schumer and whatever you two
of dollars for his border wall. But is it worth shutting down the government to fulfill a campaign promise? Joining me now is former Republican Senator Rick Santorum. He's now a CNN senior political commentator. Rick, welcome back. Merry Christmas.
Thank you, John. Merry Christmas to you and everybody out there.
So, Senator, here's my question to you. If you were advising the president, what specific deal would you advise him to cut to presumably get his wall and get the government open again?
Well, it's just, to me, it's a little counterintuitive. The Democrats are opposing more money. I mean, I don't know. I can't remember the last time we've had a budget battle where the Democrats fought and say, no, we want to control spending. I mean, the Democrats are always asking for money for everything. Well, so the president doesn't seem to be concerned about that, which is sort of counter to the traditional Republican ideas.
Sure.
And so I guess the deal is, I mean, what money do the Democrats want? I mean, there's obviously they want border, they want DACA and a whole bunch of other immigration things. Well, that's not going to be done in an appropriation bill. So what in the appropriation process, do the Democrats want as far as, more money and try to try to do what's always done in Washington, which is to buy each other off and see what their priorities are.
Buy each other off. All right. So while the deficit and debt's being exploded by a Republican president and Congress, double down. That's the path to getting a deal you advocate.
No, look, I mean, I think the president has put himself in a position where he can't really back down. I mean, he has to come home with something to improve the security of our country at the southern border, and part of that has to be some sort of physical barrier. And these are things that the president has legitimately campaigned for, talked about as president. And look, I mean, one of the things the president has not been very good at is message discipline, and this is an opportunity to sort of try out the 2020 campaign and see whether you can actually focus. And he says he's going down to the wall, going down to the border in January. Good idea. I would do a series of events leading up to that and continue to talk about the problems at the border and what it means to ordinary Americans.
All right, so you're talking campaign style. Let's switch to substance, because, Senator, you've been a longtime hawk on the issue of Iran. But with the president's announced withdrawal from Syria, a lot of experts say that puts Iran in the pole position in the region, increases their leverage. So do you support the president's plan?
Not at all. I really encourage the president. As you heard, I'm a very strong supporter of this president and believe the vast majority of his policies are sound. This one is not. This is not a good idea. This, as you mentioned, this will strengthen the hand of Iran at a time when Iran, his economy is crumbling. We have an opportunity to again deliver a real blow to Iran here in Syria, which will hurt the regime at home. If what the president wants, which I believe he does, is to like to see a regime change in Iran, doing what he's doing here in Syria is not going to help that. This will embolden and give the Iranian government something to crow about back home. Secondly, the way he did it in the face of the president of Turkey basically abandoning our allies, who the Turks see as terrorists, is just a horrible piece of foreign policy. And I'm very disappointed in the president that he would do this in this fashion. I encourage him. Look, the president has done a lot of things where he has, followed his gut and done something and then thought better of it afterwards and said, okay, look, I've listened. And I think it's really important in this case for the president to listen. His base is not solidly behind him on this. There are a lot of populists, like I consider myself, who don't want to be running around engaging in all sorts of foreign activities, but do believe that we need to stand by our allies, particularly allies who have fought and bled with us, as the Kurds have in Syria and the Syrian resistance. And for us to abandon them in such a fashion is really going to hurt him politically. And so